Welcome, welcome, welcome. Dr. Joe, how the heck are you?
I'm doing good, Dr. Dave. How are you doing?
Most excellent. We'd like to welcome our viewers and listeners to another episode of the Journeys of Not So Ordinary People podcast, where Joe and I share our, infinite forms of wisdom and experience with everyone and try to change the world
Yep,
or other
that's exactly
worlds in
what
the
we're doing.
galaxy. So,
Absolutely. Yep.
today's topic is we're going to talk about time for change of all things. Just like the need for changing our clothes, hopefully on a fairly regular basis, we need to kind
Right.
of, you know, be open to change in our own lives, in our personal and professional development, and sometimes we come to a point where it's like, hey, we need to make a change. And sometimes we know what that change looks like. And sometimes we're actually just sitting there befuddled, not sure. We know something needs to be done, but we don't know what. With that in mind, and in line with our usual cadence, where one of us introduces and immediately throws the ball to the other person, saying, "Hey, catch hot potato," and uh, and it is potato, not potato. So, Dr. Joe, what are your thoughts on time for change?
You know what? Since it's time for change, we're talking about time for change. Let's change this up. I'm going
Yeah.
to go back to you. No, I'm just joking. That's a very interesting topic. You mentioned personal and professional. How do you know when it's time to change? And I think back, and I know you all are probably tired of hearing my story, but for me, it was, at that 48-year-old Joe, average Joe, and working the same job, thinking about the future. And at that time, I realized it was time for me to change. It really was, because I, really started having that conversation with myself, that self reflection, critical self reflection. And that was before I even knew what that was. But I really started to think about, what type of legacy did I want to leave? Was this going to be it? Was I going to reach retirement age and say, hey, I don't think I did everything I wanted to do? So at that time, that's when I knew I had to change. I wanted to go down a different path. I wanted to take a different direction. And so my journey, or my time for change, initiated with that. And I know I've had, situations in previous to that or prior to that where I knew I needed to change. But this was probably one of the most defining moments when I knew I needed to change. So everything for me at that time was, I started to question myself. And so that's when I realized I knew it was time for me to change. So, what about if you're in an organization and you are becoming stagnant? You're not sure what your next step is. Is that the time for you to change? Is that the time for you to start considering what's next, or what you should be doing differently? It might be. That was really kind of what happened to me too. I was in a position where, I knew I wanted to do more. I wanted to make different decisions. I wanted to be involved more. So at that time, I knew it was time for me to change. So no different than, someone that's been working a job, say 20 years, uh, and they get to that point where they're thinking about their future. Again, are they going to think about, is it everything that they wanted to do in their lives? Did they accomplish those things? So they may start to think about changing. And so it really, again, starts with that critical self reflection, thinking about where you are today, what you where you'd like to go, and then what it's going to take you to get there. Some are really easy. The job is terrible, and it's time for you to move on. In other cases, it may not be that easy. It may be the fact that, again, you just reached a point in your professional and maybe personal life that you want to do something different. So once you identify that, then again, like I said, it's time to start thinking about where you are today, where you'd like to go, and then how you're going to get there. I often think about too. Um, oh, I lost my train of thought.
It's all right. I'll jump in. So, and when you hop back on that train, just let me
I'll
know.
jump back in there.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, what along those lines, you're talking about the professional side. There's also the personal side of things, and then there's
Right.
also, you talked about the self-reflection. There's also, along the lines of being open-mindedness, listening to others, your peers and your
Right. Yeah.
colleagues. Maybe they're seeing things that you're not. For example, when I worked at the state prison for many years, or several years, uh, my family and friends told me that I, whenever they would see me, I was changed more than the last time that they'd seen me. And over the course of 5.5 years, I did change working in that environment, and not in necessarily a good way. From a survival perspective and a career and job perspective, I changed the way I needed um, to be successful in that environment. But on potentially the downside, my the personal side of me kind of took a back seat, and my personality suffered. I was not the fun, easygoing, happy-go-lucky person
Right.
I am right now. I was much colder, harder, more distant, much more calloused, and very closed off. So when my family and friends started saying, "Hey, Dave, we're not sure this is the right line of work for you.
Right.
You've really changed, and not in a nice, friendly way," it made me step back and really do. That's what prompted me to do that critical self-reflection, that self-evaluation, and realize it was time for a change. That career, that line of work was not doing me any good in my personal life. And that's a big piece of who I am and who we all are.
So,
So
Dave, I don't mean to interrupt you, but you helped me get back on my train of
good.
thought. And so I was going to reflect back on, when I left the military, I retired from the military, and that's along those lines of what you're talking about, your mental health and physical health and things like that. And that's really what prompted me to, make that change for transitioning out of the military. And that's really
Mhm.
what it came down to, was the fact that mentally I was getting drained. I didn't realize, working a full-time job and then also trying to almost work a full-time job in the military was really mentally draining me. And then physically as well, my body was starting to break down on me and tell me, it's
Mhm.
more difficult for me to maintain, those healthy standards that were required to stay in the military. So that also dictated a time for change. For me, was the fact that mentally it was getting more challenging, and
Mhm.
then also physically too. So that's where I was going to go with that. That sometimes, your body tells you, your
Yeah.
mind tells you that you have to change.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I was able to listen to those things, because when I started to submit my paperwork, people were asking me, "Hey, why don't you stay, a few more years?" And I knew for me that wasn't a good decision, and I
Mhm.
wasn't going to be effective, and I wasn't going to just ride this out like a lot of people do, just to start getting a pension and things like that. I wanted to be an effective member of the organization, and so that again helped me to make that decision to make that change, and that was to leave the military. So
Yeah.
yeah, along those lines, what you're saying, that you know other indicators are out there that it's time for you to change. It's whether or not you pay attention to them and
Right.
listen to them. So I didn't want to interrupt you, but
No,
it
that's
just
good.
came back to me, so I wanted
No.
to make sure I got it out there.
Yeah, and those are great points because, you know, that self-awareness, you don't even have to
Yeah.
do critical self-reflection if you're just listening to your body and to your mind saying, well, this doesn't feel good, or this hurts when I do that, or
Right.
when you do it, you're thinking, this is the last time I'm doing this because it's ridiculous and I don't
Right.
want to
Yeah.
do this anymore. Those are important things where it doesn't take a lot of effort to, sit down and take days and weeks to figure out, or even hours. It's just kind of like for us, we're not the spring chickens we used to be.
Right. Right.
And when we stand up, sometimes there's some extra creaking and moaning and groaning that goes along with those joints, um, and our bones. So, pay attention to that stuff if you're, and along those lines, getting back to the personal side of things, which is as important as our professional side of things, is, you know, is the relationships that we have with others, whether it's,
Right.
you know, a personal, intimate relationship, whether it's a friend relationship. You know, listen to those people when they say, hey, maybe hanging out with this group of people or hanging out with this person or that person is not the best for you. You know,
Right.
they're seeing things from a different perspective, and chances are they're seeing things that you don't see, or that you don't want to see, or you don't want to admit
Right.
to,
Right.
that may be causing some issues. And I don't want to delve into, you know, negative relationships or anything like that, but we've all met, or either been in, or met, or have had friends that have been in relationships that weren't the best. And
Right.
hopefully we've had the courage to step up and say, hey, maybe you need to reevaluate this relationship because it's not working, or it's not fair, you know.
Right.
And so that can add to some insights to make a positive change, as hard or as challenging as it could be. Just like with your professional side of things, maybe there comes a time where you have to make that change. Like for me,
Right.
my law enforcement career ended. It really wasn't a choice of mine, you know. My body there, you know, it was basically done at that point. So I had to make a change, and I had to be open to that change and the possibilities of that change. You know, we talked about that an episode or two ago. You know, you have to be open to change and be willing to embrace it, as uncomfortable as it might be at
Right.
that time, because
No,
there's
that's an
the more
excellent point.
uncomfortable,
Yep.
the more learning that's going to occur.
Yep. I think that's one of the hardest parts of the change piece is people accepting it or willing to
Yeah.
accept it. And you know, you also touched on that personal change sometimes you have to make, and that's absolutely sometimes that has to happen for you to grow yourself.
Mhm.
You know, you don't want to leave people behind, or but you know, you have
Sometimes
to
you
really,
have to.
yeah, you have to, you have to really think about what's best for you and your family and those
Mhm.
close to you. So that's a question I've often been asked. You know, do you have to, going down that journey that I went, especially like the education piece, were there people that you had to, you know,
Let
leave
go of.
out of
Yeah.
your, or let go of it? And you do, because it, you know, to your point, sometimes that negative energy can be too much for you,
Mhm.
and it'll help derail, you know, where you're trying to go. So absolutely, those sometimes they're hard, but those also have to be done for you to
Yeah.
continue to progress. So
And there's also the positive side of personal change. You know, maybe you're
right.
used to working on cars and doing things a certain way, and you get very regimented, like, I'm going to do
Yep.
it this way and only
Yep.
this way. But you need to still be open to change, because maybe there's a better way to do it, a more
Right.
efficient, more effective, a safer way,
Yep.
a more fun way to do things, you know? So, you know, some of the stuff I do, my projects around the house, my DIY stuff, you know, I go online and I'm curious, hey, I wonder if there's a better way to do this. And there
Right.
is. And it's like, I get all excited. Or maybe there's a better tool that I'm gonna have to change from using this tool to this tool. Like, please, please, this is a safe zone, no judgment, please. But I love Android, but I was influenced to go to Apple. And you know, an adaptation, but it was a positive change. I mean, there are definitely pros and cons, but sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's the tools that we use, maybe it's the way we prepare a dish or cook or something. You know, we talk about TV and the internet, there's always new applications.
Right.
That's
Right.
positive change, hopefully, usually.
Right. No,
So
that's a
yeah.
very good point. The, I think you kind of touched on it earlier, though, about the open mindedness. You know, like you said, we talked about this one or two episodes ago, but that's really what it comes down to. Because, like you say, you could be a master mechanic for 20 years doing the exact same thing, but if you don't allow some of those positive changes into your workflow, you could be
Yeah.
reinventing the wheel, literally,
Yeah, or
because
losing
you're,
opportunities
oh,
because maybe you're fixing 100 cars a day, and now you're fixing one a week
right.
because you weren't open,
You didn't
and
stay up with the
yeah, and you didn't,
changes
and the change, yeah, you didn't stay
yep,
up for
and
the
the
time for change.
technology and
Yeah.
those types of things. So you're absolutely correct that um, change is a good thing. I mean, you know, not just changing from, you know, back and forth, but And maybe that is the case, that you do change back and forth, because you may, like you just said, you went from one phone platform to another,
Mhm.
but then you may try it
May
out
go
for a
back.
period of time and go back. So again, you gain something from that. Well, that didn't work out the way I thought it was, so you change back. So
Yeah.
yeah, it still goes back to that open mindedness, goes back to that where you are today, where you want to go tomorrow, and then how
Yeah.
you're going to get there. So
Staying relevant or just staying
absolutely.
healthy, like we
Yeah.
said.
Yeah. And so, I'll go back to that, my example for me retiring from the military, and that for that first 6 months after I retired, I I was really surprised at how much time I was contributing, how much energy I was contributing to, that part of my life being in the military. And I just really couldn't believe it, that change I made was that much of an impact for me. I mean,
Yeah.
it was really challenging to know that I had been doing so much for that time. And so it was a shock for me, but it was a good change, because it was a
Yeah.
change that needed to happen. That I, at the moment in
You knew it was
time,
time, but you didn't realize the overall
I,
impact
I
that was
didn't.
going to have.
While I was in the moment, I couldn't see those things. It
Yeah.
wasn't until I stepped away from it that I realized, that huge impact that it was
Yeah.
having on me. So yeah, I was resistant of it, and I'd spent so many years of my life being part of that, to now live without that. I didn't know if I was going to be able to do it as effectively. So yeah, for
Yeah.
me, it was a huge, um, adjustment for
Yeah.
me to do that, but it was
And
needed.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. When it's time for change, you'll know it or someone else will know it. And
Right,
hopefully they'll let you know, and hopefully you'll be open open enough to yourself to listen to yourself,
right,
that gut feel.
yeah,
Along the lines of personal, I'm going to jump over to the professional side of things, fitness. Maybe you're used to working out. Now, I'm not a huge guy. I would like to think at some point in my life I was huge like Arnold, but I wasn't. Um, but I was in good shape. And, the guys I would work out with, or the people I'd work out with, would be like, hey, Dave, you should change the way you're doing that to this. It's going to be better for your body. It's going to be safer. There's going to be less probability or likelihood for you to get injured. Lift it this way or do it that way. So, sometimes it's just refining that which we do. Going to the
right, right,
professional side of things, COVID was as bad as it was. There was some positive change that occurred. I mean, it really opened up a lot of companies to the possibility of no, we can't have remote work, to we have to have remote
right,
work.
right,
And look at all the possibilities and how that pendulum
absolutely,
swung from 5% of the population working remotely to 95% of the population working remotely, to now we're going to be settling somewhere in the middle as an average throughout most of the industries that are out there. So, keeping up on your the tools of your trade, whether it's a better hammer or a better saw or a better way to, better application for presenting, classes, whether it's virtual or blended. That's how I came over
right,
that word.
right.
Or brick and mortar. I mean, there's different ways that we can teach and educate. VR is having a big play, and AI
Oh,
is having a
absolutely,
big,
yeah,
big impact, huge impact in the learning industry. And you and I have discussed it, and we've discussed it with a few of our colleagues, that there's a lot of opportunities to incorporate a variety of different mediums into the learning environment that are being explored and critically explored, because there's a definite need for change and a time for change. We've got these modalities that we're used to using. What can we do? Sometimes it's going to be a painful adjustment because we have to learn something. We know learning's painful. It leaves big marks and scars. And don't
right,
learn. It's not good for you. No, it is good for you. Push through the pain of learning and make those positive changes, because it was hard to change going from horses and buggies to automobiles, but we
right,
did it.
right, absolutely,
And it was painful and it was dangerous in the beginning, but now it's a lot safer and a lot better. Now we have vehicles that are self-driving,
right,
which
yeah,
is a far cry from,
right.
needing three people to turn the steering wheel and hope that you don't hit that tree doing 5 miles an hour.
No, no, you brought up a good point. You talk about the pandemic and how we were forced to use the different using remote and using different platforms to continue to do our jobs. Think about, academia a few years back before we had online learning.
Yeah.
I mean, and when it first came out,
And when it first came out,
the
it was being
resistance and
criticized and
exactly the
ridiculed and being told
hesitant.
it's the worst
Yep.
thing ever. And within 8 to 10 years, every major
Every major
university,
university
private,
and
public,
college.
and Ivy League
Absolutely.
had an
Absolutely.
online program or
But
more.
think about this. That was before the pandemic. And so what happened after the pandemic? We had even my, grandson who was in grade school was learning online.
Yeah.
So just imagine if that change had not been made at the higher level, just years prior to that,
And
how
globally,
that transition would have been to
yeah.
try and get that, into the household of a lot of people during that time frame.
Yeah. And
So
a lot of people are resistant and still are to online learning for younger students and adolescents. But we really have to kind of think of this outside of our own little bubble that we live in and think about the global impact of transitioning online learning to an adolescent and teenage learning environment. I mean, it really opened a lot of possibilities for a lot
right,
of other countries and continents throughout the world who didn't have those benefits of learning in the classroom. You
right,
know, that the distance was just too far, but they did have limited internet access. Well, that limited internet access just made that, 100-mile commute or inability to make that commute possible for them to
right,
learn.
right,
From all over, from miles away, they're now collaborating in a collective learning environment. So some really good things did come out of it,
right.
and not to say that it made it all worth it, the millions of people that lost their lives, but it's just you have to look for the good things that have come out of some
Right,
of the things
right,
that have happened in history, because some good things have happened from some of the bad things. If nothing else, we learned from some of those bad things. So being open to change and being and there being a time for change, especially over the last 3 years, a lot of things have happened socially in the United States where, and you and I have talked about this offline, some of those things have been very uncomfortable to talk about
right,
and difficult to talk about. And maybe they weren't executed in the best way, but it was a time for a change and they happened. There's nothing we can do about it, but let's learn from them and press forward to make this a better place. So change can be a very positive thing. And I try to embrace change as much as possible. So
right.
on a personal
No,
and professional side.
and again, I think that goes back to the open mindedness and being
Sure.
self-aware and
Yeah.
constantly doing that self-reflection. Like you said, a lot of things have happened, and you can take one side or the other,
Yeah.
but the idea is that you make that informed decision based on what's best for you.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking back to, again, other reasons why you would change, or time for change. And I
Mm.
think about, if you're working at an organization and say things have changed in your organization.
It's just not a good fit for you anymore.
Absolutely. It's not, there could be a couple of reasons. So the organization could have gone down a path that you no longer agreed with, or
Mhm.
or it still didn't, meet your standards that you expect. And the other reason is, like you said, you may no longer fit the organization. And I
Yeah.
think that was, in my case, that started to happen for me, as I became, gain more education and more knowledge and experience. I realized that I didn't fit that organization anymore. And
Yeah. And I
sometimes,
think it's important that you've just said that, because the organization changes is one side.
right,
When we change, it's another. And maybe it's because the organization changed that
right,
was the catalyst. And sometimes it's just that self-awareness or just our own personal growth, whether
yep,
it's personal and or professional growth. Through that growth, sometimes we realize at that moment or in a moment shortly, near that moment, that it is time for a change, to your
right,
point.
absolutely.
I really
Yeah,
like that you brought that up.
and I've been in both situations or scenarios where, the organization changed. It was going down a path that I no longer agreed with, so that was a reason for me to make a change. Another instant, again, like you said, I started to outgrow the organization as
Yeah.
I was growing my development. I felt like um, I no longer fit,
Mhm.
in that organization. Not that the organization was bad, but it just, for me,
It didn't
I wasn't
align
going
with
to,
what you wanted to do or where you
right.
wanted to
It
go.
wasn't going to allow me to continue to grow.
Yeah.
And so that's when I knew it was time to leave. So, yeah, but it goes back to, we keep saying this, and I hate for us to keep, beating that same drum, but the fact that the more you are aware, self-aware, the more you do that critical self-reflection, you're going to be in a better position to make that determination
Yeah.
when
And
it's
the
time
more
for
you
you to
grow and develop
change.
as a
Yeah,
personally and professionally, the more opportunity for change is going to present itself, whether it's retiring, changing careers, changing jobs,
right,
changing industries, changing the tools that you use, changing your approach or your perspective. And time for change isn't based upon necessarily a date. Any time is a good time for change.
right,
You just,
right,
like for us, we talked about doing a podcast for how long, and
right,
finally we decided it was time for a change and
right.
stop talking and start doing.
I'm just doing. Yeah,
So, and some of that, time for change is taking action.
right. Yeah, that's a huge part of it. Yeah, just knowing you need to change is one thing, but you're right. Is the taking action part, it is the other piece of that, because you could know all day that you no
But
longer fit
until
an
you do
organization,
change,
until you make the
take,
change, then it's
yeah,
still not a change yet. So
yeah,
you're absolutely correct. That is part of it. Is to actually go through with it, to make that change, and sometimes that could be a challenge that you've identified that you need to change, but you're still hesitant. You
yeah,
haven't, struck up enough courage to go ahead and make that change. And think about this too, as you're, possibly thinking about changing or changing, for whatever reason, there are going to be people that are going to look at it differently, that you're, chasing
yeah,
something, or so it's still your choice. So,
yeah,
but just understand that, and we touched on this a little bit before, that sometimes you have to leave people behind or separate yourself from certain people, because that's what you're going to get, that
yeah.
negative, or that, having you second guess yourself, even though it's time for the change. Sometimes that affects you and other people, because we rely heavily a lot of times on our peers, our family members, and sometimes
Yeah.
their ambitions may not align with yours, or
Yeah.
their reasons for. So
Or their
just
path is now different from the path that you've decided to migrate
absolutely.
away from or
Yep.
migrate towards.
Yep.
So,
So
yeah, to your point, it's unfortunate. None of us, most of us don't like to lose people for one reason or another in our lives.
right.
We're there, but sometimes that self-actualization or listening to others that it's time for a change, sometimes you have to leave those folks behind for the
Absolutely.
betterment of yourself or your family or your career, or just because they're not willing to adapt and change.
Right. Yep.
Because you grow and you're changing. As you grow, you change and develop. If they're not willing to grow and change with you, to be there with you, then maybe it's not such a great fit after all, or maybe it's not such a great fit for that particular piece in your life.
Right. Absolutely.
So maybe you won't be socializing with them personally or professionally, but you will on the other side of things. You'll work with them, but
Right.
you'll stop hanging out with them, or you won't work
Right.
with them, but
Absolutely.
you will hang
Yep.
out with them.
Yep.
So there's lots of different possibilities.
Yep.
And I'll just say a couple of final thoughts and then I'll toss it back to you. But you know any time is a good time for change. Be open to change. Listen to others when they start saying you might want to consider a change or doing something different, um, and see what works for you. I mean, don't say no until you've tried it. I mean, not to everything, of course, but
Right.
it's
Right.
not. Yeah, go jump off a 100-foot building without a parachute. Don't recommend that. No, no, please don't. We do not advocate jumping off buildings without parachutes. So, but yeah, just be open, and at least if nothing else, consider the possibilities that are out there. So with that, I'm going to toss it back over to you, Joe, to kind of wrap things up.
Yeah. Like Dave said, it's really, when it's time to change. You
Or
you you
Or do I close this one out? I can't
You
remember.
close it, but I'll
Yeah.
just go
Okay.
ahead and give
Okay.
my final thoughts really
Yeah.
quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, the biggest part of it is you normally know when it's time to change, and it is sometimes helpful when peers, colleagues, family, friends tell you, help you with that. But most time you're gonna feel it in your gut. Hey, it's time for a change. Or if you started going down a path, you're working on your own development. You realize things don't align anymore. Then it's time for change. Or your organization changes, you need to change. You've
Yeah.
outgrown the organization. So there's a lot of reasons to change, and I think Dave mentioned before, just staying open to those possibilities. And we've said it in previous episodes. Open your mind to the possibilities, and that's what change is. Accepting that change,
And taking action to it. Yeah.
taking action. I think that's huge because again, we may recognize we need to change, but sometimes we don't, and we don't, make it actionable. So I'm not going to ramble on any longer, but again, it really comes down to that self, awareness, critical self-reflection, where you are today, where you want to go, and then how you're going to get there. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, Dr. Joe. Appreciate it. And with that, we want to thank our viewers and listeners to joining us for another episode of the Journeys of Not So Ordinary People podcast. If you've liked it, liked what you've heard or heard and seen, please give us a like, share it, share, please share, because
yep.
this is information and knowledge that Joe and I are putting out there, not to keep to ourselves, but to help others realize the possibilities that exist. And with that, thank you again. And until next time, keep on being your not so ordinary you.